Western Christianity has spent the last 2,000 years telling everyone they're separated from God.
This is Not Church with John and Nat Turney.
All right. We are back. This is part 2 with our good friend Lisa. That I tell you what, we had such a good conversation. We immediately reached out to her publicist and we're like, man, we realized after we'd finished talking, we hadn't really even discussed her upcoming book. And that was like the whole reason to have her on. But the conversation took on a life of its own, as so often happens. And it was so stinking good. We just let it go. And then John and I were both like, okay, let's see if we can get her back, because we'd really like to continue the conversation. So we are back with Lisa Sharon Harper. And we're just, honestly, we just want to roll right into what we were just talking about a few seconds ago. We want to definitely dig into your book and some of the themes of that. And, just see what we can uncover. So welcome back.
I'm so glad to be with you guys. Like literally thrilled. And I will say, I got my dog with me for at least the first 15 minutes of our conversation. And her name is Babe, and she wants to be a part of the conversation. So she just barked at me.
That's
literally,
awesome.
She's fine until we start taping, and then she's like,
Yeah.
bark, 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 bark. You know, it's so weird.
I feel like dogs can sense when the record button is hit.
I think they can.
See? We didn't hear a peep for the last 10 minutes, and all of a sudden, click record, and Babe wants to be heard. Well, Babe should be heard. There's no problem. John's got a house full of dogs, and the only reason you don't hear my dog right now is because I'm actually I'm at work. So no dogs allowed in the restaurant, but we're thrilled. We love dogs. John and I are both animal lovers, right, John?
Absolutely,
well, you more so than me. I mean, I'm an animal liker. You guys have a borderline menagerie at your house.
We're down to one dog. You know, sadly,
really?
We lost 2 dogs over the summer. So unfortunately,
I'm sorry.
we had to put down our German Shepherd over the summer, and my daughter lost while they were actually all in LA. Her little Kern Terrier passed away. So we are thinking about getting a second dog, because none of our dogs have ever been single dogs. So our single dog right now is a little depressed.
Oh, wow.
Well, they're very sensitive, those dogs.
My son brings his dog up from time to time. Actually, my son's dog is here, so we dog sit, and then they get to hang out together. So,
I'll tell you what, I just got Babe back in November of last year, and I haven't been an animal owner since I was in high school. And it is a whole nother experience to actually be the owner, not the kid, of the parent who had the dog. And it really is like adding an additional family member to your family. She's a member of our family. I love her.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't expect that. I mean, I really did. I thought, I'm going to get a dog. Because that's kind of how we had dogs that lived in the backyard. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Right.
My parents, well, both of them, their parents were from the South. One of my stepdad was from Mississippi. And so, they just lived in the backyard, and they chopped wood, and the dogs would come around, and the dog actually had a best friend, the goat. No joke, a goat in the backyard too. And so, so I didn't expect Babe to be all that, but here I have her like dressed up in a backpack. He's got boots for winter, for the snow. We're good.
You're all bougie now. You've got the backpack dog and the jewel encrusted collar.
Yeah, no trees to chop down here in South Philly. So.
Oh man, I have a story. Nah, I don't think I should tell this story. Never mind.
If you think you shouldn't. Yeah, you probably should.
Remind me, and I will tell you this story when we get off, and it's hilarious. But it's we'll hold it. And people will now wonder what we talked about. It'll be great.
Right? See, that creates tension and drama. So, all right. So, hey, enough about us, and let's talk about this book. So, this the title of the book is Fortune, and the subtitle is really pointed. What's the subtitle of the book? Remind us. It's
How Race Broke My Family and the World, and How to Repair It All.
Yeah. See, guys, it just gets right to the heart of the matter. Oh man. So without sounding too pedantic, tell us about the book, if you want to give us like the overarching sort of narrative here, and then I'd love to ask some specific questions, but just let us know what's up.
Sure. And the book actually traces 10 generations of my family story. And as a window into American history, like American racial history. And so we actually, through looking at my family's story, you look at the story of race in America. Because my family, the first American-born ancestor that we know of that was not indigenous was born in 1687, just 23 years after the very first race laws were passed in Maryland, the colony of Maryland where she lived. And only 25 years after the very first race laws ever on North American soil. So her body, her mixed race body, actually absorbed the terror of those first laws and her mind and her soul and her descendants. So her descendants we had 3 generations of indentured servants, because of the way that the law was crafted to make sure that white men who have money are able to keep their money and gain more money, even as they exploit the women in their service in particular. But, well, I can get into more detail there.
Yeah, no, for sure. Please. So for those who aren't familiar, though, when you say race laws, can you give an example of what some of those race laws looked like and what they were?
Yeah, let's go there. So the very first race law on American soil was in 1662. And you have to go back a little bit to understand what happened here. 1650, Elizabeth Key took her case to court. She was a mixed race, black and white woman whose father was Thomas Key, and actually at some point in his life was actually a legislator in the House of Burgesses. He recognized Elizabeth Key as his daughter. You could say we don't really know if this was a love affair or if it was rape. But then again, you can also say, no, it was definitely rape because he enslaved her mother and had her out of that. So at the very least, the power differential, she had no ability to say no, right? How's she going to say no?
Yeah.
He's her master. And so Elizabeth was the product likely of rape, but he recognized her as his daughter and had her baptized, compelled by the state, literally by the colony of Virginia to do that. But he did it. But then she was like, wait a minute. I'm recognized and I'm baptized. According to English law, I should not be able to be enslaved because English citizenship goes through the line of the father. It's my father who is the English citizen. And according to English common law, you can't enslave another Christian. So she took her case to court in 1650 and she won. She won. And then a lot of other people started, wait a minute, my dad is an English citizen too, because this was happening a lot. And wait a minute, I'm a Christian too. And they took their cases to court and they won. So 12 years later, the House of Burgesses says, wait a minute, we're losing our free labor. So instead of, they had a choice here. They could have said, you know what? We're going to phase this slavery thing out. We have a lot of mixed race kids here. Instead of, marking them as enslaved people, we're going to mark them as free and we're going to phase this out. That's like justice light, like really light, but it's justice light, right? They could have done that. They didn't do that. Instead, what they did was they shifted where citizenship came from. It no longer came through the line of the father. Now it came through the line of the mother. And they added 2 words that created race-based slavery in America: in perpetuity.
Oh, wow.
So if your mother was a slave, which the only slaves were black, right? Were Africans. So if your mother was a slave, then you too shall be a slave, and all of your descendants in perpetuity. That's what created race-based slavery. So 2 years after that, that was 1662, 1664, Maryland's legislature says, wait a minute, we have a race problem too, but theirs was the exact opposite of the perceived problem in Virginia. Their perceived problem, they still did have the problem of white men raping black women. That was happening, but that's not what they perceived to be a problem they would legislate about. Instead, the problem they legislated about was white women, indentured servants, falling in love with black men, enslaved black men on the plantations, marrying them on the plantations and having their children, having mixed race children. So again, the question of what's the status of these children became the main thing. And of course, the white men's bruised egos that these white women were marrying black men. So get this, you know what their response was? Their response, brothers, I need you to really take this in. Their response was to declare, white women who marry enslaved black men shall themselves become enslaved to the masters of their husbands. And their children will become enslaved in perpetuity. And the wife will be freed after the African husband dies, but her children will be enslaved in perpetuity. And guess what, guys? So after they pass that in 1664, they look up maybe like 30 years later and they realize planters are now forcing European indentured servant women to marry enslaved Black men.
So they did that so that they would have a pool, right? Of
free labor. And they would increase
in
perpetuity and increase their profit margin in perpetuity. So guess what? So it doesn't end there. So the church looks up and goes, this is a Catholic colony, right? They go, oh, we didn't mean to do this, right? So what they do is they say, okay, no longer are the keys to enslavement or indenture going to be held by the planters because they have, their own interests at heart. We're now going to give the keys to enslavement or indenture to the church. So the church then becomes the arbiter of who gets enslaved and who gets indentured. And they are the record keepers, and they often lose the records of indentured Black people so that people can be held much longer than what they should have been. And they had the most accurate records. Even the courts didn't have records as accurate as the churches.
I just find that so mind-blowing that the church would be involved even on the periphery somewhat of any of this. I mean, I don't know. I can't even hardly wrap my head around everything you just said is horrifying. And what kills me are like you mentioned a couple different times, there were opportunities to fix this, or at least to take steps towards fixing this that were just not taken.
They didn't have to make the choices they made.
No.
But they did. And at every single point, and this is what I was literally blown away by this thought and it just happened in every single era. I mean, it's not just Fortune in 1600s. It's also Henry and Harriet in the early 1800s. And it's Leah after the Civil War, before the Civil War and being enslaved in South Carolina. It's Lizzie, and Jim Crow, South Carolina. And even when she goes north to Philadelphia, it is Hiram Lawrence who lost a block of homes to eminent domain, in Philadelphia. A block. He had a block of homes, but he lost that community. But at every turn, the reason for the institution of these laws, these policies, these structures is for the benefit of white men,
right? For the
economic and social benefit of white men.
Yeah, you see it. It's as you go through the book, you see it. It's this. It's not only just. It's just. That's a horrible way to say it. It's not only white supremacy, it's male white supremacy.
That's
right?
It. That's exactly right. Yep.
So you see it here. You see it again as they change the laws from indentured servitude, which is just another word for slavery, people. You need to understand that. They weren't going to get out of this. This idea that they were going to pay their way out in some area in the near future. No, it was built into the system that was going to fail. They weren't going to get out. But then they went from this.
Let me just put this. Let me just add this one little caveat though. White folk did get out, so they had a 7-year sentence, and their sentences were traced. They were recorded by the state, by the church. So the church kept those records. But Black folk rarely got out at the right time.
But then you go into a more traditional what we read in history of the slavery, right? Of slavery, which this indentured servitude becomes a more what we see now as traditional slavery. But then as slavery is abolished, right, we have convict leasing, right? We have Jim Crow laws. We have redlining. We have the Tulsa race riots, right? Again, and what is the underlying problem that is happening is white men can't handle the idea that people of color have any way or shape are moving towards bettering their life and equaling themselves to white male dominance. And
that's exactly right.
Listeners, you need to hear this because this is exactly what's going on in this book is white male dominance does not allow room for people of color to in any way, shape, or form
breathe.
Breathe. Yes, breathe. To better themselves, to move forward in this society, to follow the American dream, right? Which for Black people was just bullshit. It wasn't true. Mm-hmm. There was no American dream. This manifest destiny idea, right? And each time it seems like they get a step forward, which, the Tulsa race riots, which if you haven't heard that one, everyone needs to read about that.
Yeah.
Is such a perfect example within a very current context of how white male dominance can't handle that, right?
Yeah. I think, and I say this toward the end of the book, I think it's toward the end. But yeah, it's in the third part. In my analysis, I think that the principal sin, the core sin of people of European descent all over the world exacted through the colonial project, right? So, through the age of colonization, which y'all called the age of discovery. We call it the age of colonization. Yeah. That's what actually happened.
Depends on what side of the thing you're sitting on, right?
Y'all didn't discover shit, but but when it came down to it, you colonized the world, right? So it was the age of colonization, but through that project, that's when the sin happened, and the seeds were sown there, and they've been running through every single generation since. And the seed was the sin of not recognizing and honoring the image of God in the other. It's that simple. It is actually simple, because the image of God, theologically anyway, it is, on the first page of the Bible is when it's declared that we're all made in the image of God, all humanity. So what it means to be human is to be made in the image of God. And what that means in the text is to be created to exercise dominion in the world, to be created to exercise stewardship of the world, to exercise agency, to make choices that impact the world. Well, when you commit genocide, and when you enslave people, and when you lynch people, and when you hem people into prisons because they sat on a park bench too long, through Jim Crow laws that lowered the bars of criminality, and when you wage drug wars that then you then pump the drugs into the community to justify going in and breaking up the community, as Nixon did. All of these are an offense, an assault against the image of God on earth. So I really do believe that the principal sin of people of European descent has not actually been to think they are supreme to other people. It's to try to be supreme over God.
Mm. Oh, wow.
To war with God.
So as you trace this back for your family, for someone like John or I, this is an academic process. You know what I mean? I can learn about it. I can try my very best to empathize. But this must have had a particularly different impact on you, especially tracing it through your family and seeing the names of people that you're descended from. What does that do to your psyche to see that that's the heritage that's been handed down?
Well, I have to say, the heritage that has been handed down that's very clear to me now is that in every single generation, from Fortune all the way to right now, we have been resistors of dehumanization. We have found ways, as Ruby Sales put it when she read the book, she was like, the amazing thing about your family, Lisa, is that you found ways to rise above and through the mess, and actually found strategies of resistance that were passed down from generation to generation. So I'm actually really proud of my heritage. Sure. I think that we were some strong people. Everyone from Fortune, who was separated from her children because they too became indentured because she was raped, likely in the course of being indentured, and so she had children. And because she was raped, she was taken to court by the indenturing family, the family that raped her, and then given 7 more years on her sentence, and her children were indentured for then 21 years because that was the law, right? So it gave incentive to indenturing families to rape their indentured servants, especially the Black ones, because they were sure to be found guilty in court, and then gain 21 more years or 31 more years of free labor, right? So Fortune did that. She lost her children But her children all came back to her afterwards. 2 generations later, though, that generation was completely lost. They crossed the river. They were brought to the other side, I believe, of the Chesapeake Bay, and made to live in Virginia when Fortune and her daughter, Sarah, their mom, lived in Maryland. And they never lived together again. I don't know if they ever saw each other again. But Fortune did move back in with her father, Sambo Game. And yes, his name was Sambo. And do you know why? Because Sambo means second son in Wolof, which is the Senegalese language that he came from in 1686.
Wow.
And
okay.
second son, I know that's part of the story. I got part of his story from his name. And Game is not the name of any white person, owner or not, in Southern Maryland, the Eastern Shore. Couldn't find any white game. So I'm like, how they took the name of the slaveholder? Right. Well, that wasn't really happening so much yet at that point. It was very early in the development of the slaveocracy in America, on American soil. And so in the colonies. And so Game started, I believe, as Gam, because you see it listed as Gam in several places, and then it's Game, and then it's Gam again. So it kind of goes back and forth, depending on which document you're looking at. But Gam makes total sense, because his ship, he was forced aboard a death ship that they called a slave ship along the River Gambia.
Oh, wow.
And so that's where his ship came from. It was the Speedwell. I know that because it's the only ship that came in like a 10-year radius or, period. That was the only time that he could have been brought here, given his age. And so Gam that's where he got his last name. And they eventually called it Game, which is, anglicizing it. So it's quite the journey. So the resilience of the Games, right? The Game McGee's, they owned land. They lived with each other. Betty, Fortune's daughter, Betty, she actually buys land at one point in the mid 1700s, 1756, I believe. She signs the deed to the land. And then in the tax records, years later, it's actually recorded that she refused to pay the extra black tax that was levied on free black women. Can you imagine that? Free black woman living out in the sticks. I mean, the sticks. I went to go see the land. It is in the middle of nowhere, but right next to a river. And, some tax collector comes knocking on her door. I can imagine her coming out with a shotgun. I'm not paying your tax. I'm not doing your extra black tax. And she just refused. And the record shows she never paid it, ever. Which is amazing. That's my family. Yes, it is.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and my mom was a member of SNCC, in the civil rights movement, and dated Stokely Carmichael for a minute, and so I think that, and also the Bomba, if you read that chapter, I love that chapter. That's the chapter about the Weeks line coming from the Caribbean,
right? And
how they learned to resist dehumanization through dance.
Yeah.
Through the Bomba dance, which is a festival, a very subversive Black festival that comes out of Black Puerto Rico. It is amazing. So, yes, I'm very proud of that heritage.
Yeah. That's an interesting part of the story. And can you kind of explain a little bit? Because your family is here in the States, but at some point ends up in the Caribbean, right? Part of the family.
It's not that they ended up in the Caribbean, although there, now that I've been doing more DNA research and everything, I think that there were probably some kind of trading back and forth between Barbados and South Carolina.
Right.
Because, in fact, the slave owner, Jonathan Lawrence, who was also a member of the original First Congress, he, I believe, had plantations in Barbados, right? So, and Lawrence is one of our family names. So on 2 different lines of our family, we have connection to Barbados. But on the Weeks line, they were originally brought there according to Ancestry DNA. They can trace like the first origins of my DNA on my father's line in Barbados, circa 1750.
Okay.
So they were likely brought to Barbados, brought into the quote, New World in 1750. The thing that blew my mind about that was that within one generation, within 20 years, that DNA was in every island in the Lesser Antilles. So they were sold into every island in the Lesser Antilles, basically everybody, everywhere but Haiti and Puerto Rico, the two big ones, the Greater Antilles. And so they were separated. So there was a pattern of separation, a pattern of broken relationship within that family, and goes on to this day.
Right. Yeah.
But eventually, my great-grandmother and grandfather met and married. They had my grandfather in St. Thomas and eventually made their way to Puerto Rico, as many Black formerly enslaved Africans did, because Puerto Rico was a Spanish colony that was much more kind to people of African descent. Because one of the settlers that founded Puerto Rico was a Black explorer. And so, they never really had anything. They placed people of African descent higher than the Dutch did and the English did, and treated them slightly better. So a lot of Black folks streamed to Puerto Rico after enslavement, and that's what happened with my family. So they lived in Santurce at the time when, right after America annexed it. And, right before America annexed it. They were there for decades. And so they saw the transition from an island that was kinder than the rest to people of African descent to coming under the rule of America, which was in the height of its Jim Crow era and eugenics. And so they saw that, and very soon after, they actually made their way to America and integrated a Jewish community in the South Bronx, which is really deep. They were among the first Puerto Ricans in the Bronx in the 1930s. No joke. They were all there by the 1930s. Most Puerto Ricans didn't come over to the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah. And at some point, there were more Puerto Ricans living in New York, I think, than living in Puerto Rico. There's a massive population shift. I had a question for you, though, because before we started recording, we were having an interesting conversation sort of about, I guess it was almost about white fragility and, the sense of white guilt. And I had a question for you, because if I think there's not just one misunderstanding, but one of the deeper misunderstandings I think that white men, especially white people, have when it comes to issues of race is we don't understand the generational, how it compounds. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So we have this knack of saying, well, yeah, but I didn't do that.
Right.
My people didn't do that. Although John and I don't have to go very far back into our past to find out we probably did.
Actually,
yeah. But I'm not racist. I have Black friends. It's just, but you know what I'm saying? Yeah. But there is this sense that I don't think we understand the impact of generations and generations. We're talking hundreds of years of what has happened, and the impact that has that you don't get to just divorce yourself from because, I didn't do it. Right.
No, that's exactly right. So for example, let me give you an example in the 20th century, right? So this is the North, not even the South. So in the North, Philadelphia, 20th century, my great-grandmother, Lizzie Johnson, escapes the terror and also the oppression of South Carolina and moves north. She leaves her darkest children behind because she's light enough. She's octoroon, so she's only 1/8 Black. And so she can pass for white. So she does. And so she ends up getting a waitressing job in Philadelphia at one of the most swanky hotels in Philly, the Grand Hotel. But eventually she's found out. And when she's found out, she's put in the kitchen because they did not have Black waitresses. They just did not allow that. And so she's put in the kitchen and she eventually becomes a baker, really a renowned baker in Philadelphia. And she calls for her darker skinned children. So just think about, there's a web of systems of oppression in that one part of the story, right? So there's the reality that she was forced to leave the degradation of South Carolina, the only place our family had known for hundreds of years. And yet she had to leave it because South Carolina, at the end of Reconstruction, passed a law that said that Black people could only work in 2 industries in South Carolina, either the fields or the house. What does that remind you of?
Yeah.
They were literally trying to reinstitute slavocracy.
The more things change, the more they stay the same,
The
right?
more they stay, this was right as the Reconstruction fell, right? So they passed that law, and it limited the ability for the image of God in her to flourish. And if you're human, you have the image of God in you. And if you have the image of God, you are created to flourish. You're created to be creative and move and use your mind and do stuff and invent stuff and dance. But with only 2 ways that you can live in the world, Lizzie wasn't having that. So she went north and she figured out a way to survive. And that was to pass, at least until she could establish herself. So she passed, she did it. And then she called for her darker skinned children when she was found out. Actually, before she was found out, and then she was found out. And so that, right? But then when she moves into South Philly, she's now redlined. Like she's now moved into a segregated area that's redlined in South Philly. Now, it turns out her block actually does have several new Italian immigrants that were not yet thought of as white.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they're living right next door, whatever. And they're living all up and down the block and whatever. But the city, get this, the city, listens to the new Italian immigrants who want the trees cut down because they want to be able to hang out their windows and yell to their neighbors and know who's coming down the block. But the Black folks who had been there for generations now, they don't want the trees cut down. These are their trees. They planted these trees. They had relationship with these trees. One day, my mom wakes up and she's like 8 years old, 7 years old, and all the trees are gone. The city had literally cut down all the trees in her community. And they did not ask the Black people who have been there forever, do you want this? So what does that do? It creates heat islands, the heat island effect. It creates higher incidence of asthma. It creates higher incidence of heart disease and things because it's too hot now to go out and go walking because you don't have shade. Now, in the 1970s, in early 1970s, Nixon targets Black communities with the drug wars, and his legislative director, Earl Lichtman, I believe his name is Earl Lichtman. Sorry, Earl Lichtman confessed to this in a 1995 interview. He said that Nixon did not launch the drug wars to end drugs coming into America. He launched the drug wars in order to have an excuse to clamp down on Black communities and hippies, his 2 political foes. Clamp down and break up the communities was the words he used. And so he did. And you know how he did it? He pumped drugs into Black communities through the mafia, through small-time dealers, and through the police. And so South Philly, the neighborhood where I live right now, 1 block from where my uncle died of a heroin overdose in the 1970s, was pumped full of drugs, and little kids that were singing doo-wop on these corners in the 50s began to drop like flies from drug overdoses, and were rounded up and put into jail. And then Reagan continued that mess with his drug war, and he allowed drugs to be, and actually ordered, I'm sure it's on some level, though I can't prove that, I don't think, but it is documented that drugs were pumped into this area, again, this time crack. And my grandmother died at the hands of a crack addict who beat her to death because he was trying to bilk her for everything she had, a block from where I'm sitting right now in South Philadelphia. So this community became it literally looked like a bombed out war zone in the year 2000 when I came back to speak at my cousin's church around the corner from here. And I said, what happened? The drug wars happened. So you have layered trauma. You see, nobody ever did anything about that law. They changed the law in South Carolina, but nobody ever said sorry. Nobody ever gave reparations for the lives the livelihoods that were never realized because of that law. Nobody ever gave reparations for the trees that were taken away and the health risks and not risks, the health impacts that had on the community for decades. Nobody ever gave reparations for the 1.5 million Black men who are right now missing on America's streets because of the drug wars, because of being rounded up and put in prison and also dying from drug overdoses. So that's layered trauma. Mindy Fully Love, sociologist Mindy Fully Love, she talks about that as layered trauma. And that is what we deal with in the Black community. We never have a moment to actually work through the last trauma before the next one comes.
Well, and just when you think you can stop and take a breath, George Floyd or something, like, okay, like at what point it's relentless, and that was the one thing. And I know that, one of the things that I've recognized about my own privilege is that I have the opportunity when I want to not think about this. Like I can leave here today and I can just put it on a shelf for a while, and I could write a Facebook post and, and sound sympathetic and whatever, but I don't have to think about this constantly. So one of those things that we talked about in church on Sunday, as a matter of fact, was, I'm getting tired of Christians who don't think that Christianity is political. I don't think Christianity should be partisan politics. I don't believe in partisan politics, but everything we do has a political component to it.
Exactly.
And recognizing that we have the privilege at times to just not even, to not think about it. When my friends of color and my LGBTQI friends, they don't have that privilege because this is their daily life every single day, and it matters, and it's life or death. And so to not speak out is to be complicit, right? And
that's exactly right.
So that's kind of where John and I both are sitting.
Add something here that, that word privilege, I mean, it's real. You see the privilege of whiteness, right? The 100%. Privilege of whiteness with the story of Fortune, and the reality that the reason why she was not enslaved, as opposed to, indentured, and all of her children could not be enslaved. And grandchildren, they all had to be indentured, not enslaved, is because their lineage went back to a white woman.
Right.
That's eventually how the law shook out, that if your lineage goes back to a white woman, you can't be enslaved. You can be indentured, but not enslaved. And so that's the privilege of whiteness right there. It's the privilege of whiteness that white men, actually, according to the law back then, they were supposed to be penalized just like anybody else, but they never were.
Right.
They never were. They were never brought up on charges, even though they were committing rape left, right, and center. At least, according to some scholarship on colonial practices of sex and domination, and then also my own DNA evidence in my own body, right? So seeing the surnames of my indenturing families, my ancestors' indenturing families in my matches. So I think that what we have to come to is we have to come to a moment of reckoning. In order for us to get past this, we have to move through it. And there's no way for us to move through it without men of European descent really reckoning with what you have lost. Like you said, I believe, Nat, that you don't really have to think about all of this. And to some degree, no, you don't. You don't have to think about all of this. But on another level, you are living it. The very reality that to be white, your ancestors had to renounce where they came from. To be white, they had to forget, like literally erase the history that came before America. And the reason they did that is because whiteness, what did it do? It gave power, right? It gave the ability to exercise dominion on this land. But what did they gain? They gained the power, but they lost their soul.
Right.
They lost connection to the land, to themselves, and to their own story. So I think that's why January 6th happened. I think that's exactly why it happened, because if your identity is tied to a phantom thread called whiteness,
right,
that doesn't really exist except for the power that people give it, and people are beginning to take that power away.
Yeah.
Then what's left?
Yeah. Well, then there's a real sense, that's the sense I get from most people who are sort of virulently racist or whatever you want to call it, is that there is a real sense that they're clinging desperately to something that they've lost or they're losing.
Yeah.
And the last vestiges of whatever this, construct of whiteness is being stripped away from them. Yeah. I guess, part of me wants to empathize because, try to find common ground with. I guess I can empathize with that fear, but at the same time, man, like you said, you're clinging to a thing that is not real. You're grasping desperately at something that is literally just a phantom. I like that word, phantom. It's a construct. It's not a real thing.
You're clinging to something that was created to give us power over somebody else. It was literally created for that.
Right.
Well, I hadn't thought of it in those terms of what we lost, because, John and I are, we're, born, bred American, whatever.
Right.
And there's very little connection to any sort of ethnicity beyond whiteness.
Oh, but see, and that's the problem.
Whiteness is an ethnicity, right? But
because white is not an ethnicity, right? White is a race.
But when I fill out a form and they ask me for my ethnic identity, I'm supposed to say white.
But see, and this is literally what I'm saying. This is before you hear in Fortune, what you'll read in Fortune.
Yeah,
is that I believe that what's going to need to happen is that men like you, men of European descent, are going to need to do your DNA. Yeah. You're going to need to figure out the rest of your story, the story that came before whiteness. Who were you before you were white?
Yeah.
How did your ancestors come here? There's only 3 ways that it could have happened. 1, they were among the nobles that were granted land. And so they were the ones that, and I say nobles in quotes, right?
Right.
The noble class that was granted land. So they came here and they were among the people who benefited on every level at every juncture. Usually, in fact, one thing I found in my research is usually you'll find the same surnames that are ruling the world now are the same surnames that were here in the very beginning.
Yikes.
Like it's so deep, but it's real. And it's been a 400-year propping up of those noble, quote, noble families. So you're either among them or you came here fleeing oppression or poverty. It's one of those 3. There's no other story that comes out of Europe. You were either noble class or you were fleeing oppression or poverty. And if you were a noble class, you have a lot to reckon with. You have to reckon with the reality that you have your riches today. You have your inheritance today because your ancestors stole land from indigenous people and likely participated on some level with genocide, and likely definitely benefited from and likely participated on some level with slavocracy. So you got to deal with that. You have to reckon with that. But if you came through oppression or poverty, you have to reckon with what your ancestors did once they got here. So for example, I think we might have talked about this last time. If you have Scotch heritage, if you're Scottish heritage, a lot of Ulster Scot people flooded into the Americas around the same time as Fortune. In fact, Fortune is half Ulster Scot, right? So her mother was Ulster Scot woman. They were becoming indentured and fleeing what they called persecution in Belfast, but what the Belfast Irish would have said was an insurrection, an uprising against people who were helping the English to colonize their land by planting plantations there, right? So what happened with these Ulster Scots people? The McGees, the family that Fortune came from, the white side of her family, they moved from Maryland down into the South, into Georgia, and then across, and they go west all the way to Texas. They changed their names when it gets south to go from Mugee, M-A-G-E-E, to McGee, so that they won't be recognized as Scottish among the Irish there. And they become among the largest slaveholders in the whole South. And that's what happened with most of the Ulster Scots who came around that time. They invested in the slave trade deeply. Why? Because they were oppressed by Europe. And when they got here, they could be the noble class. They could be the ones who actually benefited, right? So you got to figure out, where do your people lie in that? Were you not even here back then? Did your family not even come until it was Ellis Island, right? Okay, well then, where did they live? How did they interact? How did they enter into the racialized story of America? What is your part of this story? That's how you take yourself out of the netherworld of the ghost land of whiteness and reroot yourself in the reality of your actual ethnic identity and the history that comes with it, and join the human story.
Yeah. Wow, that's powerful. Now I'm
really
going to go get my DNA done because
all right.
that's really because that's helpful. There's what I love about everything that you say. By the way, I just love it drips with compassion. It drips with authenticity, but it also it's providing a framework for a path forward. So and I think that's important because there's enough of us who can very easily identify problems, or at least superficially we can. And then we get to a place of, okay, yeah, but what do we do about that? And I love that it can start with us. Okay, well, let's reclaim those things that we might not even realize have been taken from us.
Yes, exactly.
Right? So that's an interesting take on that. So there's a piece of my history, there's a piece of my legacy that I don't even have access to because we've simply adopted this false whiteness as our history and our ethnicity.
Well, now I will actually say you have a lot of access to it now. You just haven't searched.
Yeah.
I mean, it is, let me just say, there is no excuse.
There's no excuse
for anybody of European descent to not face, unless you have an ancestor who really wanted to hide. And so they hide stuff and they do assumed identities. Well, then they're not wanting you to know. And then you got to ask, well, why didn't they want you to know?
Well,
that's a story in itself, right?
Now, see, there's stories though that are coming up. I have a friend of mine who, his wife is convinced that her father's not her father. Mm-hmm. So she ended up doing her 23andMe or whatever she did just as a way to prove what she thought was right, and she's like, look at this. Couldn't be my father. I don't have any of the same history, but she also found out that she's 1/16 Congolese.
Wow.
I'm like,
so there's history there.
Well, there's history. Now I want to dig into that history because what an interesting story. So I'm always very curious because the only part of our ethnic background that John and I can claim, we're pretty sure we're Irish. And there's always there's always family folklore about some Indian heritage, some Cherokee or some whatever it might be. Most of us have stories like that, but regardless, I'm 90% sure we'll go back there and find that there will be surprises.
Yeah, I'll give you your surprise because I've done 23andMe.
Ooh, look at this!
We're gonna get a reveal on the show.
A reveal.
According to 23andMe, we are 100% European.
Oh man! Okay. I know all the stories are just what they were stories.
But do you know the breakdown?
We're 89.9. I am 89, about 89% British Irish, which kind of fits because our grandmother's last name was McCarn. Or McCairn. There's some questions as to what, and then on my father's side on my father's side, there's where we get Turney. There is some weird misspellings of that too. But like 6% Scandinavian, a little bit less than 1% Finnish.
That's dope. We deep into that pool. Although you think that the Irish
Italian.
What? Sweet.
2.3% Italian. So
there you go.
So this goes to stories that I have been told growing up, right? So and I know you've heard them, and I know Nat's heard them. Well, the Irish came here as slaves too.
Oh, goodness.
No, they didn't. First of all, everybody who is of Irish descent, you did not come here as slaves. You might have come here as some kind of indentured servant.
That's right.
Because you had to pay off your passage to this country.
Mm-hmm.
One generation or less removed, as you lose your Irish accent and you gain your whiteness, you melt right in.
Yeah. It's really true. But let me also just say that, again, this research is like, it's kind of, I'm sure, frustrating to talk with me now because I kind of know too much.
It is the opposite of frustrating. What are you talking about? This is fantastic.
I have an encyclopedia in my head now from all this research. But so in the Caribbean and Barbados, there actually was the practice of what they would have called enslaving Irish people for a time, but then it very quickly morphed into indenture, and then enslavement transferred over to Black people. Right. So they basically made Barbados a colony where they took their Irish prisoners.
Right.
So it was like a prison island kind of a thing for a long time. And then it transferred over to Africans being enslaved, and the Irish then kind of becoming the go-between between the English masters and the African enslaved people. And also, yes, you were not enslaved, you were indentured. But the reality of indenture, you said it earlier,
Yes.
It's really true. I mean, ears were lopped off. Feet were lopped off. People were quartered. People were whipped. People were hung upside down. People were hung right side up just for doing one infraction. So how I normally thought of, indentured servitude was like, it was basically like a really bad job. You just didn't get paid for it.
Right.
Kind of a bad job you're not getting paid for. But no, it was slavery that had a time limit. That is what it was. I mean, the character of it was slavery. It's the only thing that was different is that it had a time limit. So that's trauma. Y'all had trauma.
Oh, absolutely. Layered, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
But there's this idea of, and you definitely correct me if I'm wrong on this, of this. Okay, so you have this these Irish indentured servants, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Working side by side with African slaves.
Mm-hmm. African indentured servants, actually, for a long time.
Yes. But there was this opportunity for them to come together and rise up against the hierarchy.
Right.
And what the hierarchy saw that they could do is to create this division between these white indentured servants and black indentured servants and say, see, white people, white indentured servants, you have the opportunity to step out of this. We're going to give you that. And that creates a separation between these two groups of people who actually should have been working together against the slave owners and the hierarchy.
That's right. And you know what? And many times they actually did. Like many of the rebellions that happened in South Carolina and Virginia, and the Deep South and Georgia. I mean, thousands of rebellions happened, slave rebellions. But they didn't only have Black folk being a part of them. Often, especially in the earlier years, they also included indentured Irish and Scotch Irish people who were indentured because they had common cause. And even toward the in the middle of the Jim Crow era in the Deep South, Mississippi, and I believe in Alabama, there was real organizing that happened, labor union organizing that happened across race. And they began to gain real power. And that's when the powers that be, the white citizens councils and everything, came down incredibly hard on them, on the white folk and Black folk alike, and broke them up because they realized that's a real force that can really be reckoned with, or that would need to be reckoned with. So, Reverend Dr. William Barber, his father was a part of that organizing in North Carolina. And the word that he uses for that is, he calls it fusion politics, understanding that all of we are all in this together. This is not actually a matter of white people benefit from this and Black people benefit from something else completely. No, the reality is that whenever Black folks have benefited from a law or from economic policy, white people did too. A great example of that is when President Johnson launched his war on poverty. At that time, that was around 1965, 1966, right after passage of the Voting Rights Act. He launched the war on poverty. And in 1959, 55% of all African Americans were living below the poverty line. Think about that. 55%. The majority of people of African descent in America were living below the poverty line. And that was the first time that the poverty line had been codified. And so, so that's where we have it. So he launches the war on poverty. And the thing is, white folks were also pretty in dire straits. I think 20-something% of white people were living below the poverty line in 1959. Well, 10 years after he launches that, in 1975, we have now cut the poverty rate in America in half. We literally cut it in half, and we cut it by 20 points in the Black community, and it was cut down by like 30 points in the white community. Altogether. So, or not 30, it couldn't be 30. It's like about like 20 points or so. It was almost nil. So whenever there's been policies that have been focused on helping Black people to rise up out of the inequity that we started with at the baseline, white people, poor white people, middle-class white people have always benefited from that. But when we have focused on policies that help the very top, some trickle down of white middle class have benefited, but white poor people haven't. In fact, they become more poor, and Black people also become more poor.
Right. So John and I grew up under Reaganomics,
Yes.
And so the trickle down economics was, was pretty much, that was what we were taught, and that was the deal, and we all know what a crock of crap that was. I mean, those things don't trickle down, especially when the people at the top hoard,
Exactly.
and accumulate. I mean, I'm getting to a point in my life where I just don't even see the justification for there to be billionaires. I don't understand how you get to accumulate that much to the detriment of everybody else around you.
It's a combination, right? It's a combination of things. They killed the unions, which was the main way that poor white people were able to barter for better wages and better working conditions, like since the turn of the 20th century. And then after they killed unions, then they also they created the tax brackets. Whereas the top tax bracket used to, when Carter was in office, used to pay 70%. 70% of their earnings when Reagan first came into office toward taxes, and that was the lowest point since World War II, where the top bracket was paying 95% of their earnings, 95%.
Wow.
to the country, and that's how we paid for World War II, right? But so by the time Carter is in office, and by the time Reagan comes in, it's 70%. Well, by the time he left, we were at 20-something%.
Yeah.
20-something%. So what happens there? 20-something% for the top bracket. That means they're keeping a lot more of their wealth, and it's accumulating wealth. And so you basically have, over the next 30 years, you have the rise of the billionaires and the shrinking of the white middle class and everybody else.
And
too.
you don't see a correlating rise in wages. You don't see people benefit, because that puts the lie to all of that, right? When you see that wages have stagnated, you see that all this, these guys are accumulating more and more and more, and they're not. They're just not. They never had any intention of sharing that wealth. So it's a multi-generational problem, like you said. It's I don't know.
I just want. I know we're kind of getting close to the end of our time, so I want to bring up one more thing that you bring up in part of like the end of the book.
Sure.
And it kind of dovetails into what you're just talking about as the Black communities are building. I'm trying to think of the right word. It's not wealth, but as they are having a better place in society. That's bad.
I think
bad
building
language.
wealth is actually the way to put it. No, building wealth is the way to put it. We are now positioned.
Right. But we see lower class white people coming up with that, right? There's a benefit, right? So here's the question. And this is the one that's going to make some people mad. And I don't know why. I really don't know why.
It's okay.
But, reparations, right?
Yeah.
We talk reparations.
Let's talk about it. Yes.
Okay. So from that example you just give, how do we not see that by giving the African community the reparations to all of the shit that they were handed over hundreds of years? How do we not see that that's also going to raise the poor white class with them? I mean,
everybody.
Everyone. As what's, I don't know what the saying is, something about, as
all boats rise.
All boats rise. There we go. That's what I was like. So how do we, where have we missed that point? I mean, I know where. I know exactly who's feeding us this line. This isn't going to fix anything. But how do we, as for lack of a better description, how do we as white people stand up and say, yes, this needs to happen. Reparations need to happen.
It's funny, actually. Martin Luther King Jr. made this point in his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Mm-hmm. And he wrote that book months before he died.
Right.
Grab it off my shelf here. Literally grab it off the shelf. And I'm going to read you a piece of what he wrote, which I just thought was amazing and prescient because it's exactly where we are right now. Let's see if I can find it. Yeah, I think here we are. The assistant director of the Office of Economic Opportunity, Hyman Bookbinder. Great name, right? Love that name.
Great name.
In a frank statement on December 29th, 1966, declared that the long-range costs of adequately implementing programs to fight poverty, ignorance, and slums will reach $1 trillion. Now that's in 1966. I'm sure it'll be more now. He says he was not awed or dismayed by this prospect, but instead pointed out that the growth of the gross national product during the same period makes this expenditure comfortably possible. It is, he said, as simple as this. The poor can stop being poor if the rich are willing to become even richer at a slower rate.
Mm. Wow, what a cost. You're just going to have to get richer slower. Sorry.
And you That's also, right. you break it down in your book. Mm-hmm. You know, the amount of money that reparations would affect a single person and people, it's nothing. It's literally nothing. Yeah. Don't go out to eat one day.
Basically.
Literally.
Hey, that's asking a lot of me, John. This body wasn't built on, fasting and no.
That's hilarious.
It's something that definitely needs to be discussed more, uncomfortable as it might be. John and I have decided a long time ago, I think one of the things we keep saying is we want to get to a place where we just get more and more comfortable with being uncomfortable. We have to, because you can't simply bury your head in the sand and play the game as though things aren't happening around you that are uncomfortable and not right.
I would really like to close with reading a section of the book. Is that okay?
Please do.
Absolutely.
That would be amazing.
Oh,
yes.
I would love that.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I want to read you guys the passage from the last page of the book. So you know how some people flip to the back page and they read the first page, the last page first. Well, here you go.
Okay.
There are two paths set before the oppressed. One path leads to rage, compounded pain, sickness, and death. The other leads to the beloved community. On that road, there is truth seeking, truth listening, and truth telling. There is reparation and equity, and there is mercy, release. For the sake of my body and soul and the bodies and souls of my family's descendants to the 10th generation from me, I choose the beloved community. For readers in European bodies, you also have a choice. You can continue your war for supremacy against the image of God on earth. You can resist God's beloved community, resist truth, resist equity, resist justice, and resist mercy. You can try to maintain your space at the top of a crumbling racial hierarchy. You won't be there long. You are already in the global minority. Within one generation, you will be in the minority in the United States as well. And when that day comes, you can wage war or you can lean into truth, into repentance and repair, and allow yourselves to be released, forgiven. Only then can we find a new way of being together in the world. I can almost hear my 7th great grandmother, Fortune Gain McGee, who walked this land 10 generations ago and absorbed the wrath of its first race, gender, and citizenship laws into her traumatized body. In my mind's ear, I hear her whisper, "Yes, child. Yes."
I'm not even sure what else needs to be said, John.
Yeah, nothing.
I have nothing to add to that. That's beautiful. I want to close with this. Thank you. Just from the bottom of my heart, thank you for your work. I love I don't know. I just love how much you obviously have dived into this, and how much you've devoted to it, how much scholarship and research has gone into it. If you haven't bought the book, pre-ordered the book, get it. I'm getting my copy ASAP. It needs to be on your shelf in your library. And in the conversations that honestly, where I think this really needs to be front and center in the church, because the church needs to be part of this conversation if it's going to have any relevance going forward. So I can't wait to share this with my congregation, share it with the people that I talk to. And I can't thank you enough. I feel like I'm just effusive at this point of just like, I'm just enamored of everything that you have said. And, John agrees, although he's laughing at me. Go ahead. Keep babbling, dude.
Thank you, Nat. I appreciate it.
You know what, John? No. You're just going to pick up me for...
No. Nat has said it so well. There's nothing more I can add than just to say thank you also that, to give two middle-aged white guys like us a chance to chat with you and open our eyes, right? I feel like every one of these conversations is a stepping stone in the right direction.
For sure.
Nat and I have talked about, it's vitally important to be on the right side of history. We might have, I'm 51, almost 52 years old. I spent a lot of my years complacent and quiet. And, it's time to speak out. It's time to say you're either on the right side of history or you're against this, and you need to choose your side. And unfortunately, we see people doing that. January 6th was a perfect example of people choosing a side and choosing poorly, scarily poorly. And we're seeing, as we're moving forward through all this, we're seeing how this is all going to pan out. And I hope, with the Ahmaud Arbery case, and we see, it's a small step, but it's a step in the right direction. And
it's a step, it is.
And the recent decision by the judge to not accept the plea against the hate crime, I applaud that judge for making that stand and saying, no, I'm not accepting your plea. This was a hate crime, and it has to be addressed. That could have quietly gone away. A plea could have been made somewhere in a back room, which I'm sure still will happen. The pessimism in me still says, it's not far enough, but it's good to see that we're moving in that direction even a little bit. And again, I just want to mirror what Nat said and thank you for giving us the time. And we really, really appreciate you giving us this time.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for listening to This Is Not Church. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your platform of choice. If you would like to partner with us, visit patreon.com/thisisnotchurch, where you will receive exclusive content such as early access to episodes, videos of upcoming episodes, and live Q&A sessions. Be sure to check out our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode.